Good morning. As you entered the chapel this morning, you were given the text of Reverend Stephen's pamphlet that he wrote that you heard some of from Emily this morning. Reverend Daniel Waldo Stevens is our chapel's namesake, and there are many similarities between then and now. Reverend Stevens arrived on the island in 1867, given the mission to minister to the seamen by the American Unitarian Association, and they continued to support him for the 23 years that he was here. The pamphlet begins, "All seamen of whatever nation and public are earnestly invited to attend public worship there Sunday forenoon," meaning sometime before noon.
Even back then, they couldn't agree as to what time for Sunday morning service. Reverend Stevens professed no respect to persons on account of dress, color, or religious opinions. We too profess to be welcoming to all, and we display symbols of many of the world's major religions on our walls. The pamphlet goes on to say, free seats.
But now they are available for sponsorship. Soon after arriving, Reverend Stevens, hearing the island Universalists were having trouble finding a minister. Sound familiar? And so he agreed to preach to their congregation as well. So while we are officially Unitarian Universalists, Reverend Stevens connected the two groups almost 100 years before the national merger. Interestingly, the first Universalist Society of Homes Whole was originally housed in what's now Tisbury Town Hall. Reverend Stevens also advertised free gospel.
Or free doubt, as some UUs prefer. Your preference. Reverend Stevens bought the Allen House on Hatch Road, which had been an inn beginning in 1745. He bought it because of its proximity to passing ships. He renovated the house, added the reading room, and a wharf which had water available from Reverend Stevens' well. The wharf had been 7 feet of water at mean low tide at the landing for your rowboat.
Today, we have handicap parking right at the curb out front. The wharf also provided free fresh water for filling casks for the boats.
Today, we provide free coffee and cookies after service. Reverend Stevens' reading room contained 1,100 books.
Today, our library has well over 11 books. Reverend Stevens' reading room programs and materials required funds that the American Unitarian Association was unable to provide. So Reverend Stevens appealed to private individuals, and they responded generously and often anonymously. Whereas the original reading room and chapel provided letter writing materials and a U.S. post box,
today, we provide a well-paved street for your convenience, right down to the Vineyard Haven post office. The reading room was supplied regularly with over 25 different newspapers, which provided marine news for the East Coast. Nautical charts for the coast were donated, and a barometer and telescope were also added. Books could be checked out for 2 weeks at a time by sailors and the public at no cost. Many of those books, as Emily had mentioned, were donated to the newly formed Vineyard Haven Library following Reverend Stevens' death. We don't know where all the funds came from other than, quote, donations from liberal Christians, unquote, for which Reverend Stevens was personally responsible. A Methodist minister during Reverend Stevens' time declared he would rather go to a dance hall than a Unitarian service.
today he would not have to make such a difficult choice. He could attend Sunday service in the morning and ballroom dancing Sunday evening. Some things have not changed at all. After Reverend Stevens was off island attending a conference, his return ferry was canceled. To which he said, and I quote, "My detention reminds me very strongly of the many inconveniences of living on an island." Can I get an amen?
In the 1870s, Mrs. Sarah Gray and Miss May Bryant donated a larger organ. Reverend Stevens also had a horse and a carriage that allowed him to go and pick up the organist in bad weather. Sadly, we no longer provide that service. Sorry, Peter. Of all the similarities between then and now, one we hope not to repeat is Reverend Stevens mopping his own floors because he said, "Sailors tend to spit."
It's interesting to note that Reverend Stevens left money in his will to the Unitarian Convention to purchase land to build a chapel, but only if it was built within 2 years. Well, it wasn't, so it didn't happen. Fortunately, his son, also Daniel Waldo Stevens, in order to fulfill his father's wishes, donated money to the convention to purchase land, which it did. The first Stevens Memorial Chapel was built on Old Lighthouse Road, not far from here. At that time, the Grace Episcopal Church sat here at 238 Main Street. Their congregation wanted to be closer to the village. I'm guessing to help sell more lobster rolls. So they moved their building to where it is now on Greenwood Avenue. And then Stevens Memorial Chapel was also moved to here at 238 Main.
Much of this church history came from our beloved society historian and longtime member, Sarah Shepard, and her book, Unitarian Missionary to Seamen, Reverend Daniel Waldo Stevens and the Sailors' Free Reading Room. We are forever indebted to Sarah. If you don't have a copy or have not read it, there are books available here at the chapel. We hope we can listen and learn as a congregation about the stories of our past and the experience of our forebears. Much of the experience of Reverend Stevens and the challenges he overcame with secular issues such as education and poverty can guide us now. He also had to cultivate and maintain a congregation and a building with many of the same issues that we face today. We hope to benefit by learning about his ability to overcome those obstacles and be successful even in the face of pessimism. We can all still live lives of dignity, beauty, and goodness and achieve many things. Some of that can come from listening to stories from our past and be open to learning from them. We hope we've only scratched the surface and piqued your interest here today. And while Reverend Stevens did much of his work by himself, there is a place for us all. Indeed, it is a necessity for all of us to play a part for our efforts here at UUSMV to be successful.